She was 18 and sold for $47 and a horse. The words had the bluntness of a ledger entry, but what it counted was not numbers. It was the scraping of a hand across a palm, the clink of coins on a battered trunk, the way the wind seemed to make the whole room lean away, as if the house itself refused to take part in the bargain. Hannah Lee folded her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and watched her uncle, Silas, step back into the snow as the buyer mounted and turned his horse. The wagon that brought her rattled away, a shape against the white, and the only sound left was the wind, screaming through the eaves like someone in constant grief. No one had asked Hannah how she felt. The widow woman at the boarding house had put a cup of porridge down in front of her with the practical calm of small-town survival. The merchant had not looked at her twice beyond the price he had affixed to her. Silas had whispered something about debts and a far place, and a start for Hannah, and Hannah had thought she must have misheard, because it could not be her life compressed into such a sentence. Yet the sentence held. It was real. Snow lay crusted in drifts along the road when the Mercer wagon met them, and the driver, a broad-shouldered man with a face that had been mapped out by years of gales, pulled in the reins with a motion that meant arrangements and little slack for sympathy. He took the small canvas bag Hannah carried, not unkindly, and from inside it the wooden box with the photograph. That photograph, Grant Mercer's wife, had been tucked against Hannah's heart since the boarding house. It had been a small rebellion, to keep an image of another woman in a world that had decided what she was worth. The Mercer house sat low on the prairie, its eaves hung with icicles, a thin plume of smoke stitching sky to roof. The porch steps were steeped in last night's frost. When Hannah reached for the iron ring on the front door, the wood was colder than she expected, cold as if it wanted to make sure no warmth stayed inside too long. Grant Mercer opened it without haste. He wore a coat that had seen better years and a face that had stopped expecting the world to soften. His eyes were a pale, careful thing. He had hired hands and men who could do the plowing and mend gates. What he needed, he had said when Silas and he had met, were hands around the hearth, someone to keep the house steady while the ranch held its own storm. "You understand the terms," Silas muttered like a man naming a contract. $47 and the bay gelding. Hannah, who had a stubborn clarity about the small things of survival, how to catch a draft, how to wash the soot from a pan, heard the trade in her bones. It was not negotiation. It was not an offer. It was an assignment given in the language of property. The children watched her from the hallway. 3 faces, boxed shoulder to shoulder, the youngest perched on a high hip. Lucas, with a jaw like river rock and eyes that read everything as a test. Jonah, with a thin nose and a slow, measuring manner, like someone who had taught himself to be careful because the world demanded it. And Becky, diminutive and fierce, with hair the color of straw and a curiosity that made her chin jet forward as if she could take the world by the throat. Grant introduced Hannah with the economy of a man who kept the house like a ledger. "Hannah Lee. She'll keep the hearth and the bread. Stoves by the kitchen, wash in the barrel out back." He said the chores more than the welcome. They all knew how to keep the house, how to stack wood, how to tuck a child's foot with a boot. Grief had a way of coming with practice. Hannah placed her bag on a chair and opened the wooden box. The photograph slid out and settled into her palm like a warm thing. The woman in the picture wore a faint, weary smile, a strand of pearls resting at her throat. Her eyes leaned toward the camera as if expecting someone who was always late. Hannah could not help it. She smoothed the edge of the photograph like one might smooth the edge of a leaf. The house smelled of porridge and the iron tang of wet wool, of the kind of tobacco that had been left in a pipe too long. On the mantel sat a neat stack of folded notes, small slips of paper tied with a ribbon. The late wife had written them, Grant explained without sentiment, sliding into place a familiarity that was a habit and a comfort. "For the kids," he said, little reminders she set aside. Hannah's fingers brushed the ribbon. The notes were intimate in their ordinariness, reminders about turning on the coal stove, a recipe for dried apple loaf, a request to tuck a letter in Jonah's schoolbook if he forgot. They were not high words, they were gestures, instructions, things that meant daily life rather than some grand poetry of the heart. She read the first one that night, after she had stacked the wood and set a pot to simmer. The candlelight made her face long in the glass of the window. The note said in a small, precise script, "Remember to water the potted geranium on the sill. Tell Becky the birds are fools if they forget to sing." "Little bird," Jonah said from the doorway. He had been watching her. Hannah folded the scrap and tucked it into her apron. The words took a weight out of the room. They did not undo the way she had been traded. They did not make the stain of the sale lift. But they were a thread, unexpected and domestic, that ran through the house's grief and suggested the possibility of continuity, a whisper of a voice that had once tended the corners here. She learned the house by its habits. The stove drew a map of where cold slid in. There was a low hump of warmth beneath the window where the children loved to read. The pantry contained a jar of dried currants and a tin of tea that smelled faintly of bergamot. Hannah's hands moved the way they always had. She ladled porridge and swept crumbs. She mended a shirt with a needle because she knew holes could widen into bigger ones if left to their own devices. She braided Becky's hair with the patient loops of someone who had watched small things for a long time. Becky's fingers threaded through Hannah's, like a child's hand finding a ladder. Lucas tested her once at supper. He set his face into the kind of quiet that was meant to be armor. "You won't be staying if the work stops being worth it," he said, as if words could measure a value. "People come and go." Hannah looked at him across the table. "Things cost more than money," she said. The reply was true and also practical. She had lived in rooms where civility had been a currency, where small gestures kept reputations stitched together. She did not say what she had been. She had learned to reserve explanation like a steward reserves the good bits for harvest. Days folded into a rhythm. Early mornings she tended the stove and fed the fire until it turned from a throat of smoke to a reliable hum. She learned how Grant liked his coffee, black, 3 spoonfuls of sugar, and how he would stand by the back door, sometimes for a long time, staring out where the fields met the sky, as if the horizon held an answer he could not reach. In the evenings, she read Hamlet aloud to Jonah, who listened like a boy learning the cadence of things beyond the land. To Lucas, she taught how to patch a torn sleeve. It was a practical lesson disguised as craft. To Becky, she gave names to the birds that hopped in the yard, even though it was winter and birds were scarce. "The flicker's a stubborn one," Hannah told Becky. "It forgets winter is cruel." Jonah, kept a small journal with notes about plants and weather. He showed Hannah a sketch of the cottonwood they intended to plant by the lane in spring, a small rectangle of leaves penciled with the concentration of someone who found solace in plans. "Mother wanted it there," he said she'd like to see a tree when she came home. His fingers lingered on the page as if the drawing could keep a promise. Silas came and went at odd intervals, once like a rat padding in and out. He would stand at the edge of the yard and look at Hannah as if trying to calculate whether she had taken an item of his. The town's gossip came too, in the shape of passing wagoners or the minister who dropped by with a cloth for a window. Their glances bore questions and a softened, pitying curiosity that made Hannah want to gather the scraps of herself and tuck them away tighter. There were small resistances. The other hands on the ranch, men who had lived under wide skies long enough to think themselves weather, would leave their boots by the stove and not speak to her unless struck by necessity. But children are precise judges of change. Becky would climb into Hannah's lap and press her face into Hannah's sleeve as if testing the warmth. Jonah would hand her a worn pencil and ask for advice on a passage. Lucas, more slowly, brought her a small wildflower he had found pressed in a book, its color faded but its shape intact. He did not say much with it except to extend it as an offering. At nights, after she had put the children to bed and the quiet had a way of pressing its palms against the windows, Hannah would take out the photograph and sit under the low lamp. The pearls around the woman's neck in the picture caught the light and flashed as if they were small moons. The late wife's notes began to pile in a corner of the table. Hannah found herself turning them over as if they might give counsel. Some were mundane. Check the larder, sweep beneath the table. Others hinted at a care that had once been the center of this house. Remember to sing the long song on storm nights. Tuck a scrap of lace into Jonah's book if you see him look at home too carefully. One evening, as a storm breeze bloomed on the horizon and the air smelled of coming ice, Grant came in earlier than usual. He stood in the doorway with the kind of exhaustion that makes a man look as if his bones have been folded. He held something small in his hand, a locket, tarnished at the hinge. He cleared his throat and looked at the hearth. "It belonged to her," he said, voice small. "Found it behind the floorboard. Thought you'd know what to do with it, to keep it safe." He offered it to Hannah as if passing a measure of responsibility. Hannah took the locket, and inside was a single pearl, the size of a fingernail and iridescent like a throat of moonlight. She did not slip it on or wear it. To wear it would be to put a symbol between herself and the woman it had belonged to. Instead, she held it for a long time, rolling it between her fingers, and then tucked it into her apron by habit more than intent. She was practical in the matters of belonging. Some things needed to be kept until they could be given a place. When she fed the children that night, Becky leaned against her and asked the small, fierce questions of children who had learned to watch for the world's threats. "Were you angry at your uncle?" Becky whispered. Hannah smiled, a small, patient thing. "Anger won't change where we sleep, Bird, but good work will." She called her Bird because, slowly, the term from the notes and the late wife's habit had become a domestic game, an endearment without the weight of promise. It was a label that fit them all somehow, a way of naming a fragile continuity. The town bled news quietly. A broken fence in the north pasture, a man losing his cattle to fever. People arrived with small mercies, a pot of stew left on the back step, a knitted cap for Becky. The minister, a man with elbows patched and a tone of measured consolation, came by once and sat across from Grant while Hannah brought in more wood. He spoke in the measured language of men who wish to help, but knew grief lasted longer than any sermon. "We do what we can," he said. "We tend what is left." It was in the ordinariness of tending that Hannah found a new kind of authority. Care, she learned, had its own muscle and momentum. You did not command trust by saying you were trustworthy. You earned it by making a thing habitual. A boiled strap stitched each night, a bowl set for a child's return, a warmed blanket waiting on a cold porch. She was not naive about gratitude. She had seen kindness turn to commerce before. But gratitude in this house took the shape of small, recurring acts. It was a ledger kept in soups and patches, and notes folded into pockets. One dusk, with the wind trying to pry the windows outward, Hannah found a note tucked beneath the kettle handle. The scrawl was familiar, the late wife's hand, delicate and deliberate. "You are doing more than I thought you would," it read. "Be brave with them." The note did not name a favor. It did not ask for recognition. It asked for a continued, steady bravery. Hannah pressed the paper to her chest as if it were a map. After that, mornings carried a different tone. Jonah read to her more openly, pausing at words she had misread in other lives. Lucas left a mended boot in the doorway instead of slamming it across the floor. Becky began bringing a small collection of stones she found in the yard and insisting Hannah pick favorites. The house did not become a place without sorrow. Grief hung like a low curtain. It could be seen when Grant paused in the nursery and smoothed the blanket as if smoothing a memory. But presence and tending had a way of pressing into that grief and adjusting its edges. Word of Hannah's steadiness reached beyond the lane. One afternoon, a man came who knew Silas, someone from the town who had been in a tavern once and remembered the price Silas had said. He approached the porch with the cautious respect of people who knew a bad thing when they saw it. "They pay for trouble in more than coin," he offered mildly, meaning to say the sale had been wrong. He lingered on the yard and watched Hannah braid Becky's hairs. The stare carried judgment, but also a human sense of surprise, as if he had expected Hannah's flame to sputter quickly in a house of strangers. Hannah met his eyes and simply kept braiding. Her work was testimony enough. She had no need to press the wound into public discourse. She tended instead to what was within reach. At night, when the children slept and the house became the sound of breath and the occasional settling creak, Hannah would sit with the window open a crack to the cold and think about choices. She had choices, even if they had been narrowed. She could leave at first dawn, take the road and the cash Silas had left in his wake, and find another place to survive. She could mark this house on a map as a storm to be crossed. But she also saw that the hand which steadied the stove could steady a child's heart. She could let her life be measured in acts and not in the ledger Silas had written. She could choose to stay and turn the shape of what had been done to her outward into something inward and voluntary. There was, she knew, a difference between being given a place and choosing to be home. One afternoon in late January, the weather turned with the abruptitude of an animal. A storm banked in from the west and turned the world to blue and iron. The sky bruised and then let go. It was the kind of storm that hollowed a man's patience and tested whether a roof was merely shelter or a promise. Becky, who enjoyed the small bravery of pushing a chair to the window and pressing her nose against the glass, came down with a cough that evening. At first, it was no more than a rasp, something that the children shrugged off as winter's work. But by midnight, her forehead had the heat of a coal, and her breathing was the desperate, fast, small sound of a thing laboring to breathe. Hannah woke to the sound like a bell. Becky lay curled in Hannah's arms, little hands clenched like fists against the blanket. Her skin was hot, and the breath rattled in a way that stole sleep from the air. Hannah poured water over a cloth, cooling it until the material steamed, and then placed it against Becky's brow. She brewed willow bark tea as the house moved in a slow panic, the kind of speech that loses grammar in urgency. Grant's face filled the doorway, all the lines of a man kept narrow by sorrow. He had the look of someone who was used to bearing weight, but not the kind that threatened a child's life. "Call the minister," Grant said at last, voice clipped with fear. "Fetch the doctor's bag." In their town, a doctor was hours away at best. The minister's remedies and common sense were what the people had. The men bundled into coats, stonked out into the blowing snow, and came back with pockets full of necessary things: whiskey as antiseptic, a strip of clean linen, a tin of camphor smelling like hospital rooms Hannah had seen from a distance. Hannah worked with the steady hands of someone who knew that when a body teetered between life and something less, you did what you could, and you did it with singular focus. She kept water at Becky's lips in spoonfuls, held the cooling cloth to the girl's forehead until it smelled of salt from sweat, tilted the small child's chin in ways she had learned from watching women cradle infants in town. She wrapped a blanket around Becky and hummed the little tunes the notes had spoken of when storms came. The hummed songs were small domes of sound to hold the fever inside. The house pulsed with its own small station of fury, Grant pacing, Jonah clutching a pencil as if the act of writing could organize the world, Lucas leaning against a wall with a face narrower than before. They all watched Hannah as if she were the axis on which their small universe turned. She felt the weight of that attention like a glove. It was a responsibility that quickened her steps. She did not pray aloud, nor did she promise miracles. She did what she had been taught, by habit and instinct. She kept the fever's notch down as much as possible. She held and soothed. She sniffed for signs of delirium and stroked a child's back until the tremor eased. Outside, Silas arrived in the black edge of night, a figure more shamefaced than threatening, and stood in the doorway where the light cut him into pieces. He had come, finally, as if something in him could not remain in one place when a child's life was tilting. He said nothing for a long time. He stood as if waiting for someone to cast judgment. When he did speak, it was a thin thing. "This is on me," he said, voice low. He did not know the way back from the thing he had done. Words for remorse had not been part of his profession. He could only stand in the doorway and let the cold wash over him. "Not now," Hannah said softly, and she did not mean to be cold toward him. She meant to keep the room focused on Becky's breath. Silas's shoulders shifted, and he sat on the stoop like a man who carried a sack of broken coins. They labored through the small hours. At one point, after she had given Becky another dose of willow bark tea and wrapped her in a fresh blanket, Hannah found herself alone with Grant in the kitchen. The house had the kind of hush that makes words like clumsy intruders. Grant leaned his elbows on the table and closed his eyes, the candlelight hollowing his cheekbones. "She was my wife," he said abruptly, as hands find ways to speak that the heart cannot. "I didn't mean to." His voice broke, the rest of the sentence lost in the long cold. Hannah met his gaze. She had seen grief many ways. Some men shut it away like a frost. Some let it burn and then befriend the scars. Grant's grief had been a slow erosion in his face, a settling that left him practical and a little distant. But there was something else now, a fear that his children's lives might be measured by a death he could not repeal. "We're doing what we can," Hannah said, and the words landed with the steadiness they were meant to hold. "We keep the fire, we keep the tea, we'll keep watch." He looked at her then, really looked, as if he had not noticed how the small movements of her hands held the house together. The moment was not a confession of love. It was a human recognition, the kind that arrives when people realize they are linked not by choice alone, but by circumstance and by duty. "Thank you," he said, small as a coin flipped across the table. The loveliest things happened in ragged time. Becky's breath steadied, then tumbled again. Jonah dozed at the table with his pencil curled in his small fist, the waxy point worn down from worry. Lupus paced the porch and returned with a pail, rims of his eyes pink as if from crying. Silas sat on the step with a large sack of rough bread and refused any of it, though hunger had to be present because he had not walked away. Morning light broke pale and thin over the yard, and the storm had passed but left a sharpness behind. The children moved through their chores like people stepping carefully on ice. For an hour there was a silence like a held breath, tentative and hopeful, before Becky coughed and gave a thin, low sound that made everyone in the room lean forward as if hearing a central promise kept. Hannah sat by Becky, fingers on the small child's wrist to feel the steady thump of life. The house around them seemed to exhale, not healed, but not broken beyond mending. The smell of hot broth filled the kitchen, and for a moment everything felt like the ordinary rightness of tending. It was not a miracle. It was a combination of timely care and luck, and the stubborn biological bargains that govern children. But it was enough to make Grant stand in the doorway with a piece of paper in his hand, his thumb tracing the edge as if it was a talisman. He set the paper down by Hannah's cup, an awkward, private offering. On it he had written, simply, "Thank you." It was an ordinary sentence and an enormous one. Hannah folded the scrap and tucked it where she had first tucked a note not for herself but out of habit, and then she looked up and met Grant's eyes. The look they shared was not the resolution of a story. It was a hinge being put into place. That afternoon, Jonah pulled Hannah aside, and with a confidence assembled from the steadiness that had arrived in the wake of the fever, said to her, "You read to me after supper? The long one." He meant the long chapters they had begun to share. It was a small domestic treaty of normality. And so life reassembled itself in fitful progress. Bread baked, shirts mended, fire stoked. The late wife's notes multiplied as if encouraged. Little gifts found their way into Hannah's palms, a knitted mitten folded by a neighbor, a jar of plum preserves left on the sill with a note that said, in the owner's small shorthand, "For the house that keeps the children." Hannah felt herself choosing more often. The city where she had grown up felt like a memory of someone else's hunger. Each time she tied a child's boot, each time she smoothed a sheet, she considered whether to stay. Not staying would be a way of reclaiming what had been taken from her in coin. Staying would be a way of annulling the terms of that theft, by making herself indispensable in ways money could not buy. She chose again and again the work of knitting the family into new shapes. One gray afternoon, as snow softened to slush along the lane, Lucas went out to check a water trough and did not come back as quickly as he ought. A low sound, something like a pressing panic, moved through the house. They found him, finally, doubled over by the fence, a small trickle of blood staining the palm of his hand. A mustang had taken fright in a nearby corral, stampeding and shoving as only wild animals will when their terror makes them anonymous. A fence rail had given, and a bit of the splinter had found Lucas. It was a minor injury on its own, but the stampede had shaken the children in a way that showed deeper things, muscles taut around wound in memory. Grant, who had been outside mending a gate, knelt there and took Lucas into his arms, hands that had been so used to roughness, now delicate with the boy's staunching wound. Hannah came with cloth and waspish purpose, twisting linen into bandages and holding the steam of the cloth to the rawness. When she wrapped the splint, Lucas's face went from stone to a boy whose tear had been held too long. In that strain between action and tenderness, Grant looked at Hannah with a new apportioning of weight. The house had needed a steadying presence. She had become that. The ledger of her worth had shifted from coin to currency of care. He had not known he could be grateful in this hushed and ordinary language, and yet he was. He found himself thinking less about what he had lost and more about what was standing in the doorway handing him the bandage. The weeks that came after were not all bright. There were days when the memory of being sold returned to Hannah like a cold draft through a cracked window. Silas's presence at times made her skin prickle. Townspeople's looks could still be barbs. But the tender things had closed in around her, a child's palm in hers, notes tucked into pockets like small anchors, and the discovery of a garden seed packet turned up in an old coat, a cache of wildflower seeds that had been kept and forgotten, waiting for spring. One night, as late winter began to thin into an unpromised thaw, Hannah sat at the kitchen table and polished the pearl the way one might clean an old coin. She considered the way she had been given and taken. She felt for the first time in a long while a willingness to plant something that would not be merely pragmatic. She imagined a cottonwood by the lane, and wildflowers dropped like a scattering of small fates across the field. A name unspooled in her, hope, the kind of word that did not belong only to coin or contract but to future breath. But the land does not change with testing. The next morning, the children were up early with ordinary routines and silly games to keep hearts light, and it seemed like the house might have taken a new groove and settled into it. Then, as the sun had not yet climbed and the blue of dawn hung heavy, Becky woke with a howl unlike the cough. Her face had a glassy sheen. Her breath hitched with a sharpness that made the wood of the floorboards feel too thin under the weight of fear. Hannah's chest thudded in a familiar cadence, the alarm that had become the most honest part of her life. Do, tend, answer.
The fever rose like a tide. Hannah scooped Becky into her arms despite the child's resistance and pulled the closest cloth into dampness. The house flew into motion, the kind of motion that urgency makes tidy with purpose. Grant's jaw clenched, and Jonah's hands flew to do tasks he had only practiced in preparation. Lucas stood strangely still, hands at his sides, as if the world had asked him to understand medicine and the edges of courage simultaneously. Hannah felt the old ledger scrape in her bones. This was the test she had not asked for, and the one she could not refuse. She bent over Becky and set to work with herbs and towels and measures of patience she had not known she'd kept in store. But as the hours thickened and the little girl's breath grew faster and wet with a fever's threat, the house's hush became a pressure like a finger on a wound. Silas, sitting on the step with a face like an eroded stone, had come inside at last and stood in the doorway, hands clasped as in penitence, or as if clasping for warmth. He had his own brand of regret, an animal privacy about the thing he had done. He had not yet found words that could take back the money he had let pass. He could not stitch the cold of that first night back together. "Don't leave," Jonah said, before anyone realized he'd said it aloud. His voice was small, brittle. It was as if the words had been cupped for a long time and then finally offered. They landed oddly in the room, a petition, an admission, a request all wrapped together. Hannah paused, a cloth in one hand and a cup in the other. The request hung like steam in the kitchen. To leave would mean to accept the terms imposed on her at the time of a sale. To stay would mean to accept the labor of affection and the risk that her choice might be swallowed by some larger history. She thought of the photograph with the pearls and of the notes tucked like small lights in the corners. She thought of the wildflower seeds in the coat pocket, waiting for the spring that had yet to be promised. She looked down at Becky, whose small body trembled, and who clung to Hannah's sleeve as if her child's world narrowed to the contact. Hannah felt the choice in a way sharp as a blade. She set her jaw, gathered the cool cloth once again, and leaned in to do the work that would need to be done. Outside, the cottonwood shivered in a wind that still smelled of winter. Inside the Mercer house, a woman who had been bartered with coin was becoming keeper of a hearth that might one day be called home. The fever climbed, and the night stretched long. The house braced itself. If it were to become a place of healing, it would do so in the small, stubborn acts of hands, not in the rhetoric of strangers. Hannah soaked another cloth, folded the linen the way she'd seen nurses in pamphlets years before fold, and pressed it to Becky's forehead. She had decided, in the hush between breaths and decisions, she would not be a thing that was sold and then discarded. She would be a person who chose to keep. The choice was not a declaration against the past. It was a movement toward a future that could be tender and small and dangerously human. The stove ticked and spat. The notes on the mantel fluttered against a draft. The pearl in her apron warmed against her belly. Outside, a lone bird knocked against frozen branches and then flitted away. Inside, Hannah breathed with measured care and kept watch as the early light bled into the room and the fever held its precarious court. Dawn came thin and pale, the kind of light that made the hearth look like a thing that could be trusted again. Becky slept with her small face softened, breath slow and even, and when she blinked awake, it was to the careful world Hannah had coaxed into being. A cup warm at her lips, a bowl of broth set where a child's hand could find it, the sun leaking in like a promise. The fever that had roared through the night lessened its hold as if pulled from the room by sheer persistence. It did not vanish, but it yielded to the steady work, cold cloths, measured sips, near constant holding, that had been Hannah's language for weeks. There was a paper on the table when Hannah came to sit, a scrap folded and smoothed as if someone had practiced gentleness with it like a skill. Grant's handwriting, spare and a little awkward, offered the same two words he could finally make sound ordinary.
Thank you. He left it like a coin one might keep in a drawer. Hannah folded it into her palm and did not need to hide the way her throat tightened. She did what she always did. She turned care into action. A fresh pot on the stove, a bowl of toasted bread for Lucas, who had stood on the porch all night like a bellboy for grief, a small saucer of soft porridge for Jonah, whose eyes had been too alert for his age. The house changed little by little, as if warmed from the inside. Neighbors stopped by with small offerings, a skein of yarn, a pie set on the back step, a hat someone had knitted wrong side out, but with the intention of comfort. The minister, who had watched Hannah closely in the fevered nights, offered a practical compliment. You have a steady hand, and it sounded like praise from a man who respected usefulness more than sentiment. People began to nod differently when they passed the Mercer gate, and where there had been a quiet pity, there grew slowly a kind of respect. Hannah kept her old habits as if they were threads binding her to herself. She polished the pearl the way one cleans a memory until it held no shame but only light. She read to Jonah from the books he treasured. She taught Lucas to mend harness with a patience that did not patronize. She told Becky stories about stubborn birds who forgot winter and then remembered how to sing.
The phrase from the first notes, the little wife's habit of calling everyone little bird, had settled into their mouths not as imitation, but as a new vocabulary of belonging. Jonah began leaving small scraps of writing on the table, small observations about the river's ice, or the way the fox had moved along the fence. Lucas started slipping a pressed leaf into Hannah's apron, as if practice for the day he would again decide how to shape his world. The locket with the single pearl stayed in the pocket of her apron most days. Grant had found it tucked away behind floorboards and given it to Hannah as if passing a small trust along. He had not said the words that might make either of them awkward about what that trust meant. He handed it across the table, and she kept it as a thing that might, one day, have a place. She polished it with a rag and thought of the woman in the photograph, and sometimes, in the private hush after supper, she would whisper a thanks to a woman she had never known for leaving notes and for making certain small rituals of care possible. Spring arrived with a shock of green that seemed like a miracle after winter's gray. The snow melted into small rivers that cut the prairie, leaving the fence lines sodden and the pastures soft. The children unfurled with the season, their stubborn joy and small rebellions returning like the first leaves. The idea of planting the cottonwood near the lane, which Jonah had drawn in careful pencil, turned from plan to promise. They dug the hole together on a Saturday afternoon, Grant and Jonah shoulder to shoulder, Lucas turning the spade as if it were a spear against whatever grief might want to root there, Becky clapping at every clod of earth flung aside, and Hannah smoothing the soil, pressing down with the quiet authority of someone who wanted to see the tree remember a woman's wish. There were pleasures that stood beside the work. Hannah learned the exact curve of Grant's smile when something pleased him, a precise tilt at the corner of his mouth that came after supper, when the day's tasks had been done. He did not praise easily. His life had been shaped by loss and habit. When he did praise, it arrived with the weight of currency. Once, after she taught Jonah a new trick with a needle, he had simply said, "You have a way with them," and the simplicity of the sentence settled like a small thing into the house. But the prairie had other music. Herds moved. Wild mustangs ran in strips of blackened dune. There were competitions to rope and ride, and because ranching demanded it, sometimes men corralled wild horses to break them into service. They were magnificent and dangerous creatures, the kind that could forget a human mind in the second a bell rang in their skull. One dry afternoon, when the sun lay heavy on the back 40, and men had been gathering strays, a ripple of alarm ran across the pasture. The mustangs spooked, maybe at a coyote, maybe at the wind, maybe at a wagon passing with more bells than sense. The corral's rails shook. Horses bolted, a dark wave against a yellow field, and the air filled with stamped hoof and the panic of animals who had been tamed only in part. Lucas was there with the hands that had been taught by a man who did not speak much about softness. He was trying to hold on to a lead rope. He was young and brave, in the way boys are when they have nothing left to be brave for. He did not see the rail give. One instant the fence was a boundary, the next it was a blade, splintering and throwing him into the dirt. A bay mare hurdled the rail to freedom, and in her fear caught Lucas with a flank that sent him tumbling into a heap of wood and dust. People swore and ran. Grant, who had been adjusting a gate, moved as if his life had been remade in the space of 2 heartbeats. But the world acts on those 2 heartbeats. It does not wait. Hannah, in the yard with Becky on her hip,
felt the string of the world snap, and she moved like the hands that had always known work in urgency. She left Becky in Jonah's care as a matter of order, practicality and trust that had been earned, and she ran across the field with a speed that made her breath cut the air. The horses trampled, men shouted. Lucas lay half buried in splinters, a streak of red on his sleeve where a board had found him. His leg lay at an odd angle, and he made a sound that was between a gasp and a curse. A horse had pinned him for a moment, and some of the men had to drag the animal free. Others held off the rest from trampling through. Hannah dropped to her knees beside him, fingers quick as if locating habit in bone. She did not faint or stagger. She applied what she could. Cloth to the wound, a splint fashioned from a spare board, a tourniquet pressed tight enough to stop a dangerous leak, but not to choke the limb. Someone offered whiskey as an antiseptic. Someone else cut off his shirt. The smell of sweat and horse and iron filled her nose. For a long moment she simply looked at Lucas and read him like a page, where the pain sat, which way the injury had skewed, what would keep him alive in the hours to come. Grant's face was close to stone then, with a heat under it that made him move in ways Hannah had not often seen. Sharp, immediate hands that steadied the boy while her own were steadying him. The men worked together in a way that made the yard look like a hospital of rough tools. A splint was lashed. A bandage was wrapped. Lucas's face, usually set in a knowing hardness, was suddenly very young. He kept looking at Hannah with a look that seemed to ask whether what had happened could be turned back by hands. "You saved him," Grant said later, when the worst had been stilled and the boy lay with a feverish sleep for a while, his jaw slack with pain-lulled exhaustion.
The words were not loud. They were those of a man who had been taught to count measures in usefulness. For Hannah, the sentence was huge, but not new. She had kept watch against fever before. She had stitched and taught and fed and steadied. To be seen in the heat of that was a different thing. Lucas, through cough and half sleep, opened one eye and said in a hoarse whisper, "You saved all of us." Those words landed in the room like something heavy and honest. They were not a marriage contract, but they were an admission that something had shifted, a ledger rewritten by tending. The days after the stampede were threaded with stitches, literal and figurative. Lucas had a long period of convalescence. He was stubborn and sulky about it, but he was present in ways that mattered. He showed up at the window to watch the men work. He practiced with a needle and thread for hours until his fingers were calloused enough to hold his temper. And he argued with Jonah over the best place to plant the cottonwood. The family's life, tested twice by care and trauma, did not become untroubled. It became marked by a new kind of courage, ordinary and consistent. Grant began to speak to Hannah not just in the private phrases of gratitude, but in words that wanted to reach for more. He would stand where the kitchen met the hall and ask her practical questions about things he had not asked before. "Would you like a bed in the corner room? Do you want me to hang that note where you can find it?" His questions were clumsy things, the way a man casts a net when he needs to know what might be pulled out. Once, one late evening as the children slept and a slant of moon turned the thaw into silver, he sat beside Hannah and offered the locket with the pearl to her, not as an object of ownership, but as a symbol of something forming. "I found it," he said, voice smaller than Hannah had heard it. My wife, kept things like this where they could be found when someone needed a reason to keep going. I thought maybe you'd like to keep it." He held the locket out with both hands, as if offering not the pearl, but the permission for Hannah to place that object where she wished. Hannah felt the object's weight in her palm and the weight of the gesture. It was not an invitation to forget the theft she had suffered, nor was it a repair card to hand to a broken past. It was something else, an offering of trust, shaky and whole. Hannah nodded, and gently, at her own choice and not in response to obligation, she unfastened the little chain that Grant had found in the attic months ago and placed the pearl inside, and then she clasped it about her throat. It lay there warm against her collarbone like a small, honest illness, something she could feel as she moved through the day. The change did not happen all at once. There were mornings when the old ledger scraped her bones. Silas still came around sometimes, as if attracted by a debt that cash had failed to resolve. He would stand by the fence and look at the house with a blend of shame and curiosity, as if he had been given a map with one road erased. Hannah tolerated him with the practical measures of someone who knew the limits of grudges. She would accept the flatbread he offered a child, but would not take the man into the sphere of her quiet. He did not insist beyond small, awkward apology. His regret was a clumsy thing that sometimes arrived like a half-formed sentence. At length, and after the season had softened to long light, and the porch had that lived-in look of things that weather together, Silas came up the lane with something in his hand beyond the usual sack of bread. He stopped at the gate and called in a voice that had lost its original brashness. The children looked up, and Grant wiped his hands on his coat and walked out into the yard. The sun made a halo around the man's shoulders, but it did not erase the thing he had done. "I've come to try to make it right," he said, and there was no theatricality in his voice, only a quiet, raw attempt to find a road that could lead somewhere clean. He had heard about Lucas's injury and Becky's illness, and perhaps he had been moved by the sight of Hannah's steadiness. He held out something frayed and folded, a small parcel of money and a note, the latter not long, but a witching thing in its way. "I am sorry," he had written. "I did what I thought would save me. It saved no one. If you will allow it, I want to work. I will plant the cottonwood. I will mend fences. Take what money there is, and if you find a way to forgive me, fine. If not, I will make do." Hannah considered his words the way she considered every act of tending, by its effect. She did not forgive him as if he racing the ledger. She forgave him as a person might set down a heavy basket she had carried too long. She accepted his work, not as absolution for the sale, not as erasure of harm, but as a way for a man to live differently. Silas planted a seedling with his own 2 hands beside the lane. He labored on small tasks. He spoke rarely, but with attention. Over months, he dwindled the distance between them to a tolerable shape. Forgiveness did not empty Hannah of memory. It allowed her to make a room in which she kept care and consequence both. When the planting of the cottonwood came, it felt like a rite. The small tree sank into the hole Jonah had measured. Children smeared mud on one another and laughed. Neighbors came with nails and ropes and tools and left with pies and warm looks. Grant stood close to Hannah, his hands sometimes reaching for hers and sometimes drawing back as if afraid to measure his claim. In the center of the field, they placed a handful of the wildflower seeds, those little packets that had been found in an old coat, into the turned soil. Hannah pressed them in with fingers that had known both bargain and choice, and as she did, she felt a resolve stitch itself into her chest. The planting was not a single act of renaming. It was a series of daily small things that would require years to show intent, but the first motion felt like a vow. Grant asked her, quietly, if she would stand beside him in front of the neighbors and say words they both could live with. He did not ask for a promise that would erase the past. He asked for a choice that would be theirs both to make. Hannah thought of the cold counting of $47 and a horse, of the wagon that had brought her as if she were freight, and of the years that would follow where a child might be held in a lap that had known both transaction and tenderness. She thought of Becky's hand in hers when the fever had made the world small, of Jonah's small notes, of Lucas pressing a faded leaf into her palm as if pledging to remember the growth of things. She chose because she would not let the theft define the boundary of her life. Their ceremony was small. They married in a field of the first wildflowers, a patch that had sprung improbable and brave along the fence where the soil was thin. The neighbors came because people who had seen a house become something offered their presence like a woven cloth. The minister, who had become a steady if muted friend, officiated without grand speeches. The late wife's folded notes were woven into the bouquet in a quiet, nearly sacred way. One note, the little instruction to "Tell Becky the birds are fools if they forget to sing," was folded into the stems and tucked beneath the ribbon, as if the absent woman's voice could still direct small acts of domestic rebellion. When Grant offered Hannah the ring, an object chosen, not salvaged, he did it slowly, as if laying down a stone that might become a marker on a road. He held her hands in his and said the most simple things, the ones that had become useful between them. "Be my partner at the stove. Help me keep what we have." Nothing extravagant, only the truth of 2 people agreeing to make a life in shared work. Hannah said yes because she had reasons that were hers: choice, love, and the recognition that her hands, which had once fed and mended for survival, could now do so for a family she embraced. The town's acceptance was not universal at once. Old whispers lingered in corners, but most people met them with practical courtesy. The minister gave a quiet, private blessing. Neighbors stopped by to bring a kettle of stew. Silas stood at the edge of the celebration as a man who had earned a place by labor rather than by charm. They danced, if one could call it that, around a small fire with fiddles that had been brought for the occasion. Becky ran barefoot even though the ground still held a bite, and Jonah recited a poem he had made up about trees and promises. Lucas, with his leg mending, limped and laughed anyway.
The pearl at Hannah's throat caught firelight and sent out a tiny, steady glow.
After the wedding, spring turned fully, and the wildflowers that had been scattered at the cottonwoods planting pushed up as if in applause. They made a quilt of color across the field: pale blues, yellows like small suns, purples that bent toward the sky. Hannah spent hours bending and watching, hands in the dirt, noting how something sewn by hand could be coaxed and tended into bloom. The pattern felt less like possession and more like invitation. Months went by with the shape of ordinary joys and duties. The house filled with the sound of a life that had been repaired through repetition. Grant and Hannah found a rhythm. She woke early to stoke the fire. He rode until dusk and told her the small things that had happened on the range. They ate with the children and sometimes disagreed about trivialities, like whether Becky should be allowed a penny before bed. These arguments made space for ordinary affection in the way small stones make paths over a marsh. One evening, as the cottonwood cast long green shadows over the lane and the wildflowers bowed with a soft, persistent beauty, Hannah felt a change inside her that was slow and undeniable. It was not new. She had felt it as something like a turning. When she told Grant, he touched her hand as if touching an instrument he knew how to play, and looked at her with eyes that were both startled and grateful. They did not shout or weep aloud. They simply arranged the practicalities of care in the way they had come to do. More porridge, fewer late rides, a slow procession toward a future that would include a child. The news was like a seed in their pockets, one that required careful planting. Pregnancy in those days was a thing of both celebration and still caution. Hannah moved through it with the same steady hands. She tended the house, her body, and the children with a full inward attention that made everything else feel possible. The town murmured in the way towns do. The pair who had been awkward in courtship now carried their small public duty with calm. Silas, who had come to do tasks around the ranch, found a place to sit quietly in the afternoons and watch the children. He would bring a basket of eggs and set them down with a note to be used in the bread. No proclamation of sin erased, only a daily account of small reparation. The months folded into one another and then into labor. The birth did not arrive like a cinematic explosion, but as an accumulation of contractions, a tightening, a movement that made the room alive with focused work. Hannah labored with a calm she had honed in the nights of fever and injury. Grant held her hand and counted the space between breaths with her. Jonah hummed the songs the late wife had asked for on storm nights, and Becky whispered silly facts about birds that made people laugh shakily between waves. The baby came with a wet, fierce cry and a body new to everything. She was small and sure and pink, and instantly claimed by the house as its own. They named her Hope because the word had been waiting in Hannah's mouth for months. It fit the wildflowers and the cottonwood and the ways their life had bent toward continuity. The name was not a promise that erased the past. It was an honest, tender naming, a decision to place a word on a life and watch it grow into meaning. The baby fit into Hannah's arms like a new kind of tool. None of them had all the instruction manuals, but they had the practice of care. Grant watched them with a softness that was almost a landscape change. He had been a man carved by loss, and now his face carried a light that made small features soft. Silas came to see the child with hands that wanted to touch and eyes that wanted permission. Hannah gave it with the same practical generosity she had offered in work: a nod, a small step forward. He cried, which was unexpected in the hard man, and he kept his distance in a way that meant he had learned boundaries. He handed the baby a tiny knitted cap with a flaw in one stitch, and the offering was received not as redemption, but as presence. Hannah forgave him in the quiet way she forgave things that lived in the world. She let go of the violent ledger and accepted the change of his life into a form that would no longer harm them. The years did not become a fairy tale. People still remembered that she had been sold. They still had the initial image of a wagon leaving a boarding house. Hannah, for her part, could sometimes feel the old ledger in the back of her mind, an itch that would not entirely leave. But where that ledger once mapped out what she could be, it now mattered less. Her life had built a weightier accounting: meals given, hands held, stitches made, trees planted, promises kept. She had turned a thing meant to own her into choices she owned. She had been purchased once, and then again, in every small insistence that she remain.
Hope grew amid the wildflowers. The cottonwood became a tree that birds visited and sailors of insects nested, its first tender leaves cupped a sound like blessing. Becky, older by a few years and still fierce, loved to hold her and parade the infant as if showing off a triumph. Jonah read to her and traced letters in soft childish script. Lucas, healed in leg and heart, taught the baby how to watch a horse move with the caution of someone who had been trampled by life and had learned to step softer. Grant, whose grief had not left but who had learned to carry it differently, as a man carries a pack that keeps the cold out, would stand in the doorway and watch them with an expression that held gratitude like a privately kept treasure. On one late spring afternoon, when the wildflowers were in full array and the sky was a wide, clean blue, Hannah walked out to the field with Hope in her arms. She knelt in the grass and let the child move her fingers through clover, watching the world with serious, new eyes.
She had not become the woman she might have imagined at 18. No, the arc of that path had been carved differently, but she had become someone whose agency had been recovered in full, whose choices had become the architecture of a family. A wind came up, and the cottonwood leaves made a sound like 1,000 small hands. Hannah thought for a moment about the woman in the photograph and the notes tied with ribbon on the mantel. She thought of the ledger entry that had opened this chapter in her life, $47 and a horse. She let the memory sit like a stone at the bottom of a creek, visible, but smoothed by currents and by the hands that had turned over its edge. The sale had been a violation. It remained wrong. But it did not hold the contours of her days anymore. She pressed a small knuckle to Hope's hand and felt the tiny grasp close, strong and insistent. Around them, the wildflowers leaned into the sun, and someone in the distance, Jonah perhaps, called out a harmless joke. Silas worked at the fence and waved absently. Grant took up a tool and then put it down, watching his family as if he might always have to convince himself it was real. Anna smiled, a slow, warm thing, and tucked a folded note into her apron, the one that the late wife had written long ago about singing in storms, and then crossed the field to sit beneath the cottonwood. They had come from a house of pain to a home that lived its truth imperfectly. It was not that suffering had been erased, it was that tenderness and choice had reconstituted what had been taken. The pearl at Hannah's throat caught the late sun and threw back a small, steadfast light. When the evening grew soft and the children were called in for supper, Hannah stood and brushed dirt from her dress and walked back up the lane. The wildflowers swayed like a small chorus, and the cottonwood sighed above them. Home, she thought, was a verb. It was what they did, again and again. It would be something they tended, not merely a place that had been given by bargain or law. She cradled Hope closer and let the wind lift the scent of the field into a small wild benediction. If anyone asked where their story began, Hannah could point, in answer, to a wagon in a blizzard and to a coin that clinked against the wood of a trunk. She could say honestly that she had been sold for $47 and a horse, but she would also say, firmly, without varnish, that what came after was a longer, truer ledger. Nights of tending, days of choice, a boy's courage, a man's quiet reopening, a stranger's contrition, the planting of a tree, and a child called Hope who was named not to erase the past, but to make a future. The field stretched behind her, wildflowers bowing in the light, and she let the words settle into her like seed into soil.